to cover. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our climate conversation series. My name is Shweta Arya. I'm the executive director of Delaware Interfaith Power and Light. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm so excited that you have decided to join us for this conversation on offshore wind. Just to give you a little background on Delaware Interfaith Power and Light, if you're not aware of our nonprofit, we are a faith-based environmental nonprofit working on climate justice and climate change since this is our 10th year. Since last 10 years, we have been working with faith communities and community stakeholders in addressing climate change and climate justice. And climate conversation is part of our climate education program, which is funded by Energize Delaware. Energize Delaware is a nonprofit created by the state of Delaware, which helps businesses, residences, nonprofits to get more energy efficient and climate resilient. So please check them out. You can check them out at energizedelaware.org. They have loans programs and that can help you. So we're very thankful for Energize Delaware for funding this program. And this series also today we are participating in a worldwide climate justice teach-in. So we are one of the thousands climate conversations taking place today all over the world. So we are very excited to be part of this worldwide teach-in. There are two other congregations that are participating in this teach-in, and we are very excited to be part of this whole teach-in. Climate conversation program started a couple years ago. This is our 43rd climate conversation, and we have engaged more than 1,500 people. And the mission and goal of this climate conversation is to shift the narrative from gloom and doom that mostly people think about when they think about climate change to something positive where we can really talk about solutions. Because as sad as this crisis is, the climate crisis, the brighter note is that we have the solutions right in front of us, and offshore wind is one of them, and we're very excited. I would request everybody to please mute themselves throughout the presentation. Michael, if you want to move to the next slide, please. Just the housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If we have time at the end, we will take questions. Next slide, please. We'd like to especially thank our co-sponsors today. Delaware, Power, People for Offshore Wind Energy and Resources, the Delaware Audubon Society, Unitarian Universalists of Southern Delaware, Delaware Center for Inland Bays, and UEDAN. So we are really excited that they helped us promote this event and helping us make this event successful. Next slide. This is just the run of the show. We're going to start with our keynote speaker, Professor Willett Kempton, and then we'll get into a panel discussion. We have guest speakers, and we'll be introducing them soon. And then we'll have some time to get into. We'll take some questions from the attendees. And now I would like to invite Peggy Schulz, who will then introduce our keynote speaker, Willett Kempton. Peggy, before you start, just let me give a little background on why, Delaware IPL has been working on climate solutions for a long time. We really feel it's our moral obligation to work on climate change. And we know that there are three main products that are creating the majority of emissions, right? Oil, gas, and coal. And the sooner we can transition our economy to renewable energy sources, sooner we can solve this problem, and solutions are right in front of us. So we are really working closely with Power. So I would like to invite Peggy Schultz to just take a moment to briefly share a little bit about Power, and then invite our guest speaker.
Thank you, Shweta. I'm happy to be here and speak a couple of words about Power. It stands for People for Offshore Wind Energy Resources. It's a coalition of organizations that support an offshore wind project for Delaware. Some of our members are Fridays for Future. We have an electricians local, Citizens Climate Lobby, Delaware Interfaith Power and Light, League of Women Voters. We have a couple of physicians organizations, Global Urban Development, and many others. Power was instrumental in working out an agreement between DNREC and UD's Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, or SIOW. The agreement resulted in—
Remember, it gave us such a long time out. I would suggest calling.
The agreement resulted in a scientific analysis of the issues associated with an offshore wind project for Delaware. And this analysis will be the subject of the remarks of our well-known speaker for tonight. I put my email address in the chat box, and I hope you will contact me if your organization would like to support an offshore wind project for Delaware by joining our Power Coalition. There's no money commitment, we just need your support. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Willett. Willett Kempton is well known to most of us, but on the off chance that you've not met him or heard him speak, you should know that he's a nationally recognized expert on offshore wind. He's a professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. He's technical advisor for the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, or SIOW, that I mentioned a minute ago. And that's at the University of Delaware. And this latter group is the source of an important report requested by DNREC, as well as by the energy committees in both the House and the Senate. He's lead author of an SIOW report for Massachusetts and a contributor to an SIOW report for New York, reports that led to substantial offshore wind commitments by both those states. Professor Kempton.
Thank you very much, Peggy. I appreciate the introduction, and Shweta, thank you for hosting and creating this whole panel. I'll need to have a person who's sharing now stop sharing so I can use slides with this. And you should be able to see a slide, the title slide here. You can move the faces and names around with your mouse if that's blocking part of the image. So I appreciate the interest in this topic, and appreciate the opportunity from the state and as Peggy said, Power advocacy to be able to do some analysis for the state on this. Just to introduce the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, this is housed at the University of Delaware and provides expertise in analysis and financials for offshore wind. We provide factually based reports, and we rely not only on our own internal people like me as an advisor, but we recruit experts, and also we have peer review of any reports that we do, drawing in people who are knowledgeable about the topic, as well as critical reviewers. We are philanthropy funded, governed by an executive director, Chris Oleth, and board. There are no commercial interests. We're funded by nonprofits. All prior studies that we've done have been requested by a state, sometimes by public institutions that are not a state, but and they have, I think, in all cases, been utilized afterwards as Peggy mentioned, both New York and Massachusetts initiated major offshore wind programs based on our recommendations and others. And as she mentioned, the Delaware study was requested by 2 entities in state government. The topic of this seminar is climate, of course, and so I want to just take a minute to say why offshore wind is important for climate. You've got many sources of renewable or non-CO2 producing electricity, including wind and solar, as well as nuclear and hydro. So why offshore wind in particular? We, as I'll say probably a couple of times, I don't think we have to have only offshore wind. That's not at all what I'm saying. But offshore wind is now cost competitive with wholesale power that we're buying. We, meaning the utilities, are buying in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. So when it's not an increase in cost, obviously there's less opposition to shifting to new electricity sources. There's a very large net benefit in reduction of CO2, which means mitigating climate change. And we'll look at some numbers for that. It's also a huge resource. I mean, very, very large. So much more than needed to run 100% of Delaware's electricity needs, or for that matter, liquid fuel and electricity needs. And it's, of course, right adjacent to us. It's right off the coast. So the project size that's now cost effective can displace a quarter to a third of Delaware's electricity. So literally one project, you knock something around a third of the electricity off carbon producing sources. It's more difficult to get to 100%, but just sort of a first cut on the arithmetic, 3 projects would give us a carbon-free electricity system. So it can be very fast as a way to get CO2 out of our electricity system. It's the pace that we need. We can't say, well, we're going to invent something new and in 20 or 30, 25 years it'll be commercial, and then another 50 years after that will displace all the carbon. We don't have that much time. So we do need something that's commercial now, which offshore wind is, and cost competitive now, ideally, which it also is. So that doesn't mean you can do it right away. It only takes 2 years to build a project this size, which is pretty amazing. But it's 4 years of paperwork and permits and contracts and so forth. So it's a 6-year build, but that could be staggered. So it could be done more quickly if we really had a sense of urgency on climate change, which of course many of us think that would be appropriate. But already right now we can do this in 6 years, maybe 7. So that's why it's important for climate. Huge resource, cost competitive. Each project knocks a third off Delaware's electricity. Knocks the carbon out of the third of Delaware's electricity. So the way we operate SIOW is that, sorry, went the wrong direction there. So we do have a report. It is a finalized report. It is into the state government right now in DNREC. And hopefully will be released very quickly. Just sort of showing the cover there, the 4 authors, myself, Lillian Peterson, who I say is just entered the waiting room here. And she is co-author Amy Bosteels and Chris Olith, who is the director of SIOW. So each of these brought some different expertise, and then we have a bunch of advisors and reviewers in addition. So what we cover in this report, and I'm going to use most of the rest of the time to review this report and contextualize it in climate change as well. What is the price of offshore wind power today? Because that has changed in the last just few years, and how does that compare with the cost of conventional power? And then, because we find the cost is comparable, how can the state create a procurement process for offshore wind? Because the price is highly dependent on how the state decides to go ahead with a project. So we describe how to make an efficient request for proposals and bid evaluation, and what actions the state can take to reduce the cost of electricity from offshore wind. So the state has a huge amount of control over what the cost is. We also give some actions in this report the state can use to increase employment or create new businesses in Delaware or near Delaware. Overall, there are 4 co-authors, as I said, 4 advisors who gave expertise in different parts of this, and 9 expert peer reviewers who went through the whole thing and corrected a number of errors. We're glad to see, and added some points. So that was good. This is a sort of a preview. There's a few things, specifically some of the numbers on the request of DNREC. We're not releasing those yet, but we're sort of giving the overall structure of the report and the structure of a procurement as well. I'm going to read the last bullet first. When you buy offshore wind, it's not really a state that buys it, but a state kind of controls the process, because that's the way electricity regulation works in the United States. But it's not like going to a store and buying apples, comparing 2 bins of apples, and each one has a price marked on it. It's more like your neighbor did a contract for remodeling their house, and you decide to do a contract also. And I say that because you can tell the contractor, well, I want this kind of wood, and maybe that kind of wood is much more expensive than pine or something. You can tell the contractor, hey, you're going to have to stop working between June and July because our cousins are all coming to visit. We don't want work going on then. Well, okay, they can do that, but that means that people are laid off and there's some restarting and all that. That's going to add to the cost. And you say, well, you can't come in the front because it's really nice and we don't want mud in there. Well, all of these things that you put into the request is increasing the cost. And what we show in this report is that some of those things have really raised the cost of offshore wind in other states. So we don't say whether the state should or shouldn't do those, but we show how much you can reduce the cost, or how much, if you do certain things, it increases the cost. So what are the basic sort of overall principles here? How the state can control the process and control the cost. You obviously have to have competition. You want bids, you want the potential providers of power competing with each other in sealed bids where they don't know what the others are bidding. This is probably going to lower the price more than having a price cap where everybody bids right under that price cap. You want the state to issue a request for proposals with requirements. And before you get to that point, you want to qualify the bidders. You have to make sure people who are bidding actually have site control. That is, they have a lease for use of the ocean. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a federal agency, issues those leases. And the bidders must have the capability of building a complex $2.5 billion project. So they have to have creditworthiness. They have to have knowledge of marine construction and so forth. Without that, you're just going to get a lot of noise in the bids. And if you don't get any bids, or you only get one bid, then you don't do the project. The state is going to manage the process. States control electricity in the United States, but ultimately the purchase of the power will be from the utilities. So the utilities will be signing a contract with the winning bidder, if there is a winning bidder, to purchase power under certain terms and conditions, and at the price that's been bid. The price has to be stated up front by the bidders. Now, what we found is, assuming the process is done in a cost-effective way, that the cost of offshore wind that we would expect when a project like this is built, which would be 2027, it's actually getting ready to be generating power, would be about the same as what Delmarva Power is paying for electricity now. So that means that you don't necessarily need price support mechanisms. So this is a new finding. When we did reports for New York and Massachusetts, we said the cost of power is going to be above market. So you, the state government, have to decide that you're willing to pay a premium to get certain other benefits. But that's no longer true. And in fact, in both of those cases, our projection for what the price would be was higher than it actually turned out to be. Can't promise that would be true here, but we followed the same methodology. This is not some kind of lowball estimate. This is a well-supported estimate. And as I say, in the past we've not been low. We've been higher than the actual projection. But we're trying to predict costs, 5 years in the future, which is a dark art, of course. And we're also at a state where it used to be like, oh, offshore wind's expensive, so let's build a small project. It's kind of reversed now, because a small project is expensive for various reasons of industrialization, mobilization of equipment, rent, leasing of equipment, and all that. If you build a project smaller than 800 megawatts, you're probably paying a premium price. So that 800 to 1200 megawatt that we show in that bullet is a cost-effective size. Might be easier for Delaware to absorb 800 megawatts than 12. There's a bunch of things we couldn't calculate exactly, but certainly there would be no problem with absorbing 800, and that's a fairly cost-effective size. Just overall, in procurement of power, the state may put some environmental conditions on. There may be some good reasons for some, and we have, of course, an environmental agency that will review this project, but primary environmental requirements will be put on by the federal government. State government can add if they want, but we will hear from some expertise in the inland bays and also avian issues of what things we might want to be careful to look out for. But nobody's forgotten the environmental impact. This is a big project, and
offshore wind.
Somebody's got their mic on. So there are going to be state requirements, and there will be federal requirements for environmental review. Okay, so just to give a sense of the way this process starts, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management designates areas that may be developed for offshore wind. And there's 2 types of areas on this map. The darker areas are places that have been leased already as much as 10 years ago. The Delaware wind energy area was roughly 10 years ago. Actually a bit more than that. And then there's Maryland. They're sort of named as states, but they're really all federal waters. So these have been leased for some time, and then as of just 2 months ago, I guess it was February, they have the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is a division of the Department of Interior, has designated these as what they call call areas.
Delaware is Maryland.
So Delaware's up the top, and then Maryland's next one down. So these areas will be trimmed down a bit for possible conflicts and maybe environmental concerns that haven't been addressed yet. There's already gone through a pretty big trimming down, but there may be more. But you can get a sense of the amount of area out here. And just for a scale, this thing, which is called the Delaware Wind Energy Area, but right now most of the power from here is going to Maryland. If you just squared that triangle out a bit, so it's more like a square instead of a triangle, that's the amount of ocean space with today's turbines that would be needed to run the entire state of Delaware. So just think of that square as all of Delaware's electric use. That doesn't mean households. It means industry, commercial, all electric uses in the state, that area. So you can look at these other red areas and see how much more electricity capacity there is just right off our shores and off the Delmarva Peninsula. So that's the first step in the process. BOEM, as you can see from the dark areas, has already done that for some areas. There's some space left in some of those. And then there will be a lease sale, it's called, I think by the fourth quarter of this year, which will designate buyers for additional space, and then that would give them the ability to apply for building a project. So that would give what's called site control in real estate development or commercial development. I'm not going to go through this detail, but we've looked through at the schedule, sort of how much time it takes for each thing, and drawn out a schedule which will be in which is in the report that will be released by DNREC. One important one is the fourth quarter of 2025 is the deadline for applications for the investment tax credit, and that's one of the things we list that the state needs to be very careful to have things ready to go for the investment tax credit. It's applied for by the developer, but if they don't have a contract already awarded, they're not going to want to put down the money. You've got to put down 5% of the cost of the project, which is very substantial by that date to qualify for that tax credit. Without that, it's a substantial increase in the cost of electricity. That's a federal tax credit. So we, as I mentioned, went through options for the state to reduce cost. For example, this costs nothing for this, but it reduces cost because it increases competition. The state can urge the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to create more wind energy area leases near Delaware. You saw that red area that's just offshore Delaware. Well, it hasn't been turned into leases yet. So it's in the interest of the ratepayers of the state to have some of those designated as leases so that there will be more bidders trying to bid in and sell power to the state. More bidders, more competition, more likely you are to get a lower price and maybe other beneficial terms.
Actually do this.
Somebody's talking and still got their mic on there. So the other thing is transmission cable landing. It's a very right now distributed process where beach communities may discuss, may not make a decision for a while, sort of have to answer to constituencies who may have objections that are not really related to the project. So that could be better defined. That would reduce the cost because it would reduce the risk and the unexpected delays to the project. So these are all options for the state. We're not saying they should or shouldn't do them, but we show how much that could reduce the cost of electricity to do these. State could coordinate electricity transmission access. We already have 2 Maryland projects which are requesting access through Delaware lands and across the Delaware coastal zone to provide power to the peninsula, because Delaware has the high power lines. When you go further south from Delaware into the Atlantic coast of Maryland, there's not very much in the way of transmission lines there. They're quite small. So if the state were coordinating with those projects and a new Delaware project, that would reduce costs as well. The fourth item here, DNREC could provide a review of regulatory processes for building in the coastal zone and make sure that those are addressing the problems and non-problems of offshore wind, and that they're not going to change any rules or regulations, but just is the guidance for how to step through that process clear. In some cases, an offshore wind project may not know whether they're supposed to file under some area or not, which was designed for quite different uses. So there's a review and then providing guidance in the rules. So these are things that cost a little bit of staff time, but can have a noticeable reduction in the cost of electricity. Install a meteorological buoy prior to the request for proposals. If you know the wind speed, a developer, you can better target exactly how much electricity you'll be able to produce for the fixed cost of building the turbines, and therefore you can predict better how much the electricity needs to cost for you to pay your costs and make a little bit of profit. So that the state can do much faster than the developer can. There's some cost there, but that cost will be more than repaid in savings to the ratepayers. So again, maybe the state wants to do that, maybe not. We're listing things they can do to reduce the cost. And then right sizing the project. I mentioned already, an 800 megawatt project is sort of cost effective, a commercial size. That also is, in terms of climate, it's a third of Delaware's electricity. So those are options for reducing cost. We have options for employment, and some of these cost money, some are not really, again, not necessarily much cost other than just some staff time to kind of check things are done right. A developer can contribute to a job creating entity, like an offshore wind component factory. That's a lot of cost. Maybe it's worth it. In Maryland and New Jersey have both done that with really very substantial quote contributions from the developer. But guess what? The developer just adds that onto the cost of the project. So that's really the ratepayers that are paying for that. So maybe a good idea. It definitely could create jobs, but it's a cost increaser. So that's something where we tried to show how much cost would be added by that particular measure, where you say the developer has to do some job creating entity. Another one would be operations and maintenance in port in Delaware versus being maybe in another state combined, so that one O&M facility could do several projects. Again, pros and cons, we just show what the cost would be. Marshalling port would be another facility. Delaware actually has an area that would be very good for a marshalling port. The marshalling port is the last point where you have manufacturing. You assemble components at the marshalling port, like marshalling an army before going out into battle. And then when you have all the parts there, you bring in a big installation vessel, which loads up the parts for, say, 3 or 4 turbines, then goes out and installs them and comes back. So that's a big investment, but it may not actually require any state or developer money. It's maybe something that pays for itself, to be determined, but that's a type of thing that Delaware could have built as part of a project, or just, being in the industry and buying electricity makes it easier to attract customers for that kind of a port. But the developers will pay for use of such a port, so it doesn't need to be a state entity. It could be a private entity. Similarly, workforce development center, where you're training blue-collar workers for working on projects. And that's an opportunity to bring in a diverse workforce as well. Again, may or may not need state or developer subsidy, but these are just things that are job creating entities, and sort of what steps the state could do to encourage them, or get the developer to encourage them. It's a really small one, just another example, an offshore wind visitor center, where you could look out, maybe see the project, or have some computer screens with readouts and some informative displays, perhaps in a tourist area. And the project may be so far out you can't see it really, but you could have a visitor center, and we kind of look at how that could be done and where and what the cost would be. And we have a section on sort of a little more future looking, because this is all sort of, we're going to displace some of our existing polluting power plants with a new source of electricity, but actually what we see other states thinking about, New York, California is just a California Offshore Wind Conference. They're thinking about how do you use, because the amount of electricity here is more than we need to run all the coastal states. They're thinking of, how do you do e-fuels? How do you do hydrogen? Or maybe you turn that hydrogen into ammonia and use that in fertilizer rather than using natural gas in fertilizer. Or maybe you turn it into methanol and use it to power some kinds of transportation. Methanol is hazardous to handle, so it's probably not good for passenger vehicles, but for shipping maybe, or for long distance trucking, you might use methanol. So we look ahead a little bit, and kind of what industries could be created over time if Delaware has a large source of electricity from offshore wind power. So I'm going to talk about electricity measurements just briefly here, so that you can kind of understand things if we have more debate on this, and so you can understand when I say an 800 megawatt project, what that means. I use watts and average watts. That's the measure of power. So it's how much is flowing. It's like gallons per minute if you're holding a garden hose. A mobile device like a cellular phone, might use a maximum of 2 watts. On average, it's using about a watt. So that's the electrical measurement, a watt. So when you're measuring those kind of mobile devices, you're using watts. And if you look at the bottom of a toaster, or you look at your cell phone charger, you'll see that it's measured in watts. It'll give you the watts for that device. When you're looking at a house, you're measuring kilowatts, so 1,000 watts. A house with a 100 amp electrical panel would have a maximum use of 24 kilowatts. But most of the time you don't have all your high using electric stuff on. So on average, a US house uses 1.5 kilowatts. That's average size, separate detached house. Okay, so you can see there's a big difference in some of these between the maximum that something may consume or produce and the average amount that it does produce. In this case, it's use, but we see the same thing with variable generation like solar and wind, where the average amount produced is less than the maximum. And so when we move from houses, mobile devices in watts and houses in kilowatts, when you move up to wind turbines, or large solar arrays like you would have in a community solar system, then you're measuring megawatts. So that's 1 million watts. Today's offshore wind turbines, maximum power is 15 megawatts, and they're rated in the maximum power that they produce at about 25 mile per hour wind speed up 120 meters up in the air. In our offshore environment, today's offshore wind turbines on average will produce 6.8 megawatts. So that's a 45% capacity factor, it's called. So the maximum they can do, the capacity, nameplate rating, you see all those terms, 15 megawatts. The older numbers that when we reviewed, for those of you who remember, Blue Water Wind, those are 3 megawatt machines. If you've ever seen our wind turbine in Lewis by the campus there, you get close to that, that's a really big machine. You have to strain your neck to look back and see the top of it. That's a 2 megawatt machine, 2 megawatts. And today's offshore machines are 15 megawatts. That's the capacity, that's the way it's rated. Okay, so now let's talk about a wind project. So that's, like I said, a commercial size is 800 megawatts. Now, it doesn't have to be that. You can build a 15 megawatt project that's got 1 turbine, or you can build a 30 megawatt project that's got 2 turbines. But this is a commercially, low cost, cost effective, takes 2 years to build, size 800 megawatts. And by the same rating, it's going to, on average, produce 360 megawatts. On a really windy day, it'll produce 800. On a really calm day, it'll produce 0. On average, it's 45% of that maximum rating. And other power plants, are kind of typically rated in the 100 to 500 megawatt. A large nuclear double reactor complex might be 1,000 megawatts. And their average, I didn't even put down a number because it varies so much in how they're used, how the power operator, the grid operators control them, but they'll tend to be between 10 and 90%. They're intermittent too. People say wind's intermittent. Well, power plants are intermittent also because they have unscheduled outages, something goes wrong. And then the state of Delaware. Well, the state of Delaware is kind of like a house. It consumes electricity, right? So I don't know the maximum actually, but it's a bit over 2 gigawatts. So kilowatt, 1,000, megawatt, million, gigawatt, billion. So it's a billion iPhones. That's what the state of Delaware uses. It's about 1.2 billion iPhones on average. Okay, sometimes more, sometimes less. So that kind of gives you the scale here, and you can see where 800 megawatts fits in, or maybe more appropriately, 360 megawatts on average power, how that fits in. Why I say it's about a third, maybe a third to a quarter of the state by one project. We've met about that amount, and that means that much reduction in carbon production by the electricity system. So how do we compare prices? Because that's an important part of the finding here. It's hard to compare because every year when Delmarva buys a new batch of power, it's a different price, right? And projections for next year is the cost of natural gas is going to go up by 25% or 28%, something like that. So our power is going to go up in the next couple of years by that same amount. So we just looked at the last 6 years and said, what's the average of that? Okay, that's what we've been paying. We're not trying to project how much it's going to cost next year in thermal fossil power, because we don't know what the cost of fossil fuel is. We don't know the amount that the co-op or the munis paid, because that's not a public matter of public record. Delmarva is publicly regulated, an investor-owned company, so we know exactly what was paid for power when they bought. And another question is, how do you include federal subsidies or state subsidies? Well, state subsidies, it's just the taxpayers or the ratepayers paying for it through a different, mechanism. So we would include state subsidies in the cost. Federal subsidies are out there and they're going to happen anyway. So we don't include those in the cost. And there is an investment tax credit right now for nuclear and for offshore wind. It's actually exactly the same amount of subsidy for nuclear and for offshore wind. So we don't include those when we're saying what it will cost Delaware ratepayers for electricity. That's the way we handle that question. and we showed in the report, we showed some of the things, as I mentioned, that have made electricity more expensive. How offshore wind has been made more expensive for other states. It's another thing that's different is when you buy renewable energy, whether it's solar or land-based wind or offshore wind, you're mostly paying back a loan, so kind of like buying a house, you pay the same amount every month for 20 or 30 years. Now there is also operations and maintenance, so you do have a little bit of repair costs, but that's very predictable. So when you buy from a offshore wind facility, you know what you're going to pay each year for 20 years. It's typical to say, well, we'll escalate it each year by the consumer price index or by 2%, 2.5%. So same as you're paying on year 20. You cannot get that deal from any producer of power from fossil fuel because they don't know what their input costs are, and therefore they can't give you a rate. So it's really, again, apples and oranges. Maybe wind is a little bit cheaper the year that it's available, and we say, hey, we'll do a 20-year contract, and suddenly, natural gas and coal and oil just drop in price, and it was turned out to be a bad deal. Or maybe we get a 20-year contract for wind and the cost of natural gas goes up, which I think is a lot more likely over the next 20 years. Then we get a better deal in the future. But again, it looks like the kind of first year price would be about the same as what we see. So, but it's not apples and oranges. It's a set price. You know what it's going to be for 20 years versus the current situation, which is it's a new contract every year or every 3 years. So there is also a cost for CO2 emissions and pollutions. And I think Alan Greenglass is going to talk about this a bit, but we did show that in the calculation of cost. But we don't. When I say it's about the same cost, we're not even including that. We're just looking at market cost for current power and market cost for offshore wind. We do include that. We use the White House numbers for cost per ton of CO2 emitted, and EPA's numbers for the cost to health of power production. And the cost for CO2 is, if you translate from tons to megawatt hours using average production in the mid-Atlantic, that's $40 a megawatt hour for CO2, and 41, coincidentally, almost the same number, $41 a megawatt hour for the health costs. So those are, federal, very well vetted numbers. Let's see, one of those, I guess it's the CO2 cost is being challenged in court, but these are, they're big, they really affect your understanding of it. We're not arguing, and we don't even give this an option, putting on a CO2 cost or anything. We just think to understand what's more expensive, it's helpful to look at that. So here, yep.
We love your presentation, but I just want to remind you that if you can wrap up in 2 minutes, we can move
2 minutes. Yep. Good. Okay. Yeah. Good. Thanks for the reminder. So here's market price, and we don't have dollars on this scale now because we've been asked to not put that out yet, but it will be it's in the report, and you'll see that fairly soon. But this is the last 6 years of this top gray bar. That's the cost, and so we've got different ways of measuring the current purchase and different ways of estimating what the cost of offshore wind will be. So each one's got different. You can look at what method you think is the most accurate and pick your bars. But this is a price. So from low price to high price on the right. So there's a range of over the last 6 years of the cost of wholesale power. So there's not one price, like I said. If you add in the health cost, it moves up to here. And if you add in health plus CO2, it moves up to here. So it's all a range, but we're mostly, when people say, what's the cost? They're only looking at this bar. That's the market cost. So we have, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but we have various ways of estimating what the cost of offshore wind will be, and they are affected by what the state does. But it's in this range, whether you're looking at prior projects or what the Delaware project would be. And again, you can see it's about the same cost. It might be a little lower, it might be a little higher, but it's about the same cost as what we're already paying. And what the state would do, and with input from citizenry and organizations that are concerned about this, we're got three things we're trying to prioritize. One is low cost of electricity. We don't want to pay a lot for electricity. Second is reduced emissions, and that has an effect on health and climate change. When generation is evaluated, generally that's not included, which is kind of weird, but it doesn't mean advocates can't say we think it should be included. And then a third is good jobs in growing industries. So these are all trade-offs, but they don't necessarily work against each other. So right now, current market, if you want lower cost of electricity, you want a bigger project. And if you want reduced emissions, you also want a bigger project. And if you want good jobs, you also want a bigger project. Now, too big, you get to issues of managing excess power and so forth like that. But these are the trade-offs that many of us on the line will have slightly different priorities maybe. So conclusions, market price from offshore wind is within the range of current market prices, not including any state subsidy, no state subsidy in those bars. Market price is misleading because it's missing the cost of health and climate costs, which is about $81 per megawatt hour. In comparison, wind price has a carbon cost. You have to use carbon to making steel and getting the boats out there and all, but that's 44 cents per megawatt hour. And the cost of thermal power is $80 per megawatt hour. So yes, it's in there. And in fact, it was in the bars. Like all the wind bars had the cost of carbon stuck in there. So in its big steps, like I said, 30% of Delaware's power sector potentially in one project. And to get the low prices, you have to have a well-structured procurement process. We provided a guide for that. We don't say you have to do this or that, you're the state, but here's the options for reducing costs and in some cases for increasing employment. So that's the talk. I maybe made it just within 2 minutes, or maybe I was 3 there, Shweta. So thanks for the reminder.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Willett, that was excellent presentation. And we are going to share this recording and the slides. And now, Willett, if you can stop sharing your slide. Michael, if you want to put the other slide speakers. We are excited. We have several guest speakers here who will be sharing and we'll be bringing in for a panel discussion, Chris Basin, who's the Executive Director of Delaware Center for Inland Bays, Dr. Alan Greenglass. He is the main facilitator for newly created Mid-Atlantic Alliance on Climate and Health. He was also the past president for Physicians for Social Responsibility. Shiloh Felton, Field Manager, Clean Energy Initiative, National Audubon Society. And of course, Professor Willett will be joining us in this panel discussion as well. So thanks, Michael. And if you could stop sharing that slide, and we can bring on the other guest speakers and put the spotlight on them. All right, and Willett and Shiloh. If I can find, and there you are. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we can get right in. There's just so many questions there in the chat box. I was looking, and I don't know if we can get on everything right now, but why don't we just get started with if each one of you can just briefly take a couple minutes to share about your organization, your role, and why are you here in support of offshore wind today. So maybe we can start with Shiloh first.
Sure, thank you so much. And thanks, Willett, for that wonderful introduction about offshore wind in Delaware. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And thank you for the invitation tonight. So I'm here representing National Audubon Society. Audubon protects birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. We work throughout the Americas, using science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation. State programs, nature centers, chapters, and partners like you give Audubon an unparalleled wingspan that reaches millions of people each year to inform, inspire, and unite diverse communities in conservation action. We're a nonprofit organization founded in 1905 that believes in a world in which people and wildlife thrive together. We know that climate change is by far the biggest threat to birds, and that's why I'm here. We support clean energy that is sited, operated properly to avoid, minimize, and mitigate effectively for potential impacts on birds, other wildlife, and the places that they need. I work for Audubon as a field manager for their clean energy initiative, where I focus on offshore wind nationally, as well as onshore wind and solar along the Atlantic and Mississippi flyways. I'm an avian ecologist by trade, and I come to this position with Audubon after years of working on projects focused on conservation in the face of human-wildlife conflict. I received a PhD from North Carolina State University, where I ran a project on American oyster catchers at Cape Hatteras National Seashore. And I've worked on various other shorebird projects from Alaska to Cape Cod, and even tagged some of our beloved red knots on some of those projects. So I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight.
Thank you. Dr. Allen, you want to go next?
Sure, and thank you everyone for your interest, and once again, thank you Willard and Shiloh and Chris and Shweta. I'm a retired primary care physician. I also was a healthcare executive at Christiana Care Health System here in Delaware. And my interests when I was in practice at Christiana were in population health and social determinants of health. And social determinants means what's happening in the world around people that impacts their well-being. So the environment, pollution, smoking, diet, housing, those are all social determinants of health. And as I started to participate in discussions about air quality and water quality and climate change, which are social determinants of health, which we'll talk about a little later, I realized that no one was talking about the health consequences to humans of climate change and of pollution. All the conversations at the state level, the policy level, were about cost. How much would the electricity cost? How much investment would we have to make in wind or solar or nuclear? And I found that very frustrating, because the bottom line to anybody in healthcare, and I think to all of us, is the well-being of ourselves, our families, our children, our communities. And it turns out, as I research this further, that, as Willett said, there's a large financial cost to poor health. And climate change and air quality, water quality impact health negatively, and all have financial costs related to that poor health. And as I was talking to other people, other health professionals and environmental groups, I realized that a lot of people shared the same concern, that we were having an economic financial discussion, but we weren't having a health discussion. And incidentally, it turns out that, as I said earlier, health has a big financial impact, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But just as a preview, that every Delawarean is paying $2,000 to $2,500 each year, including our children, because of poor air and water quality. And those are well-documented studies, both in Delaware, nationally, and around the world. So what we decided to do is to form this organization called the Mid-Atlantic Alliance for Climate and Health. It now has 16 member organizations, including the Medical Society of Delaware, the Delaware Academy of Medicine, the internal medicine and pediatric professional organizations in both New Jersey and Delaware, the organizations representing obstetricians and family physicians in Delaware. So every medical specialty in the state has signed on. The Sierra Club, the League of Women Voters Delaware Interfaith Power and Light. And just to finish, our mission is to provide education to health professionals and to the public on the impact of pollution and climate change on health, and to advocate for public policies and individual responsibility to protect the present and future health of our society. And we're agnostic, whether it's solar or conservation, energy efficiency, or wind. Our goal is to reduce our dependency on coal and on oil and on gas. Those are the things which are hurting our health today and in the future.
Thanks, Dr. Allen. We will now move on to Chris Basin. Chris, if you want to take the floor and share a little bit about your work, what you're doing, and why are you here?
Thanks, Weta. Hi, everybody. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces, and thank you for having me. And I'm glad to be here with such great speakers. And I'm Chris Basin, and I live in Ocean View, and I'm the director of the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. And we are also a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to protect and restore Rehoboth Bay, Little Assawoman Bay, Indian River Bay, and their watershed. I think probably a lot of you know about these bays. They're very beautiful. They're shallow coastal lagoons. They're the places where the rivers meet the sea. And that's why they are so productive with wildlife, with fish, with shellfish. And they have a tremendous economic contribution to Southern Delaware because of the recreation and construction and realty industries that is supported by the bays. So our job at the center is to clean them up. They've really suffered over many decades from a lot of nutrient pollution and habitat loss. When I'm talking habitat, I'm talking oyster reefs, underwater bay grass meadows, and wetlands that have disappeared. And we've had a lot of success as a group of stakeholders, as a group of community representatives to clean up these bays. But the threat now is increasingly with climate change. And the communities that live around our bays are extremely vulnerable to climate change, as are the resources. Some of the projections that we've seen is that we're projected to lose almost all of our salt marshes around the bays by the end of the century if we don't take some extreme action here to reduce greenhouse gases. And salt marshes are the base of the food web for our bays. So that's just an idea of just how important it is that we address the issue of climate change. And in our management plan for the bays, we do have actions related to climate and promoting renewable energy, whether it's solar, wind, or whatever. It's a very important action that we take. So we educate about renewable energy, we promote it, and we work very hard to protect our communities and clean up our bays. So a little bit about me. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and my background is in estuarine science and wetland ecology. So thanks again for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And Willett, I think we've heard from you, so I will skip you for the introduction, if you don't mind. We will move right on, but my first question is for you, Willett. So what are and this question is actually from Sharon Kimmel, who had submitted this question before. What are the objections that are slowing down implementation of offshore wind for Delaware, and how can we overcome that?
Well, I think the primary concern, I mean, there are many different constituencies, of course. I think the primary concern is that the price has been substantially above the cost of electricity. If you take Alan's perspective, based on very solid epidemiological data and kind of standard public health measures of what it costs to have someone with asthma, have someone miss work days, child unable to go to school because of respiratory problems, those costs are not included when people say it's expensive. And I think that's an incorrect way to calculate costs. But given that that's the way the Public Utility Commission does it and the way a lot of people think about it, an industrial user may really be more concerned about the cents per kilowatt hour that that they're paying on their production costs, not because they're cold-hearted, but because that's their business. Given that, whether we agree with that or not, I think that's been the biggest objection. Now, there are many other kinds of objections. You know, there's some people who don't want to see something on the seascape that is not part of the natural environment. And for some mysterious reason, oil tankers don't count, but offshore wind turbines do. So that not wanting to see that is something that a few people object to. We've done a lot of surveys, and you know, it's whatever 10-20% or something that would find that objectionable, then that's fine. It's no longer a totally natural landscape when the tankers aren't going by. So that's an objection, and that's not something that's really going to be solved, except that you saw those new lease areas after the Maryland projects are built out, which will be closest to Delaware. The remaining projects are going to be so far out, it'll be very hard to see them, especially under normal meteorological conditions. They won't be visible at all. So that's a concern, and it's just a matter of one's aesthetics and, you know, how much do you care about climate change, how much do you care about health, versus how much do you care about a pristine ocean view. You can't sort of scientifically say one's right or the other's wrong. It's a thing that people express in hearings, and ultimately our elected representatives decide sort of how to trade those things off. Though I think you can't really completely separate what the concerns are that have slowed us down, if you will, from there is, of course, you know, other interests who don't want competition for power. You know, it's not necessarily that clean power is bad, but if you spend a bunch of money to buy a power plant and you're selling it to Delaware utilities, you don't want any new power production, you know, no matter how dirty or clean it is. So there's going to be some noise generated. It may not be legitimate, but it's put into packages that sound like there's something to it. And so, you know, if you just sort of if you get all your information from social media and you don't look into detail, then you might, you know, I think some people have objected because of things they're concerned about from information sources that may have their own interests, but they don't express them. They don't say, I'm a power producer, I don't want competition. They say, you know, XYZ is a terrible thing about offshore wind. So I think it's all of those things, but, you know, we hope in a more deliberative process that our administrative agencies and our elected leaders will rely primarily on the best information from many sources. Of course, they're not going to just rely on us and our report here, but hopefully that'll balance out.
Yeah, and then I was going to add then, you know, we also need that strong political will and people's support. So, and we're definitely working, I think there are several groups working to make that happen, and anybody who's interested in seeing this move fast can definitely work with us. My next question is to Chris. There have been suggestions that the location of Ørsted's skipjack wind farm will impact horseshoe crab populations because of its intersection with a horseshoe crab reserve. Is there causes of concern? Can you comment?
Anytime you're talking about the horseshoe crab population, there's cause for concern because it's such an important animal. And horseshoe crabs are what's considered a keystone species for our bays. And a keystone species is one that has like a disproportionate effect on the ecosystem, right? They're super important animals. And for the crab, it's because every spring they come ashore and they lay all their eggs all over the sandy beaches, and their eggs feed dozens of different bird species and fish species. And even the horseshoe crabs themselves, the young ones, can be eaten by sea turtles, which are threatened or endangered. A lot of them are. And the red knot is, one of our favorite birds. A lot of these shore birds have this stopover on the Delaware Bay, and they eat these horseshoe crabs to fuel up before they continue on to the Arctic to get to their breeding ground. So the red knot is threatened. So that's a particularly sensitive species to the horseshoe crab. But they support the whole ecosystem. If you walk around the bays, you can see the birds eating the eggs after spring all year. It's just a buffet. and it's a beautiful thing. But sadly, the horseshoe crab has, like so many of our species, it's been decimated, and it was over harvested in the 90s. The culmination of the over harvest for fishing happened at that time. They're harvested for the bait industry and the biomedical industry. So, you know, the goal for the crab is to bring that population back. We want to restore our wildlife and have healthy species and healthy populations of fish and crabs and everything that eats them. And that's the key to that, is controlling the harvest. And their populations are rebounding slowly, but that's where we got to really focus on if we want to bring the crabs back and support the ecosystem. Now, one of the things that was done to do that was the creation of this horseshoe crab reserve. I wonder if anybody has ever seen the location of this reserve. It's huge. It is giant. If you go like 3 miles off our coast, it begins and it goes like 30 miles out east and then 30 miles up north, like the whole Delaware coast at the mouth of the Delaware Bay, and then up New Jersey. So it's a giant, giant area. And it was established to prevent the take of horseshoe crabs, the harvest of horseshoe crabs. And it was named after Dr. Carl Schuster, and he was a hugely important horseshoe crab scientist from back in the day. Just passed away recently. But when you think about what are the wind farm impacts on this reserve, there are going to be impacts on there, but they're going to be pretty small, and they should be mostly confined to where the turbines are sited. So I believe one of Ørsted's farms has area within the horseshoe crab reserve, and I was told that by Ørsted that it was going to be less of 0.1% of area in that reserve that was going to have structure on the bottom that could potentially impact horseshoe crabs. So those structures are going to be associated with the wind turbines, and those turbines are going to be like a mile apart. So I know horseshoe crabs. I spent a lot of time with them, and horseshoe crabs are pretty good at navigating up and down the coast. They're able to find the Indian River Inlet and come in the inlet and go up the tidal creeks and find the beaches. So avoiding those areas is not going to be a problem for the horseshoe crabs. It's not going to have any appreciable impact on their population. Another thing to think about is that if you put a wind farm down on the bottom, you know, a base of a turbine down the bottom of the bay, it doesn't eliminate habitat. And there's some science to suggest that it does create habitat because it's going to function as an artificial reef. Little mussels are going to come in and set on the rocks in the base of the turbine, and that's eventually going to form an underwater biological community. So it's not just that bay bottom is displaced and eliminated. A new ecosystem is created under there, which certainly will attract fish. It might even increase production of fish in the area. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about horseshoe crabs. We love the crabs. They're very important to our culture, and we certainly want to protect them.
Thank you for describing it so vividly for me. I feel like I need to make a trip down to, to inland bays and maybe join one of the
You do. High tide in May and June at a full moon is.
I'm signing up. I'm signing up, Chris. Thank you. My next question is to Shiloh. All bird lovers at some point are concerned with these windmills, right? So my next questions to you is, there are several potential negative impacts of offshore wind power development on birds: displacement from existing habitats, risk of collisions with wind turbines, and wind farms as migration barriers for birds. Can you comment on why Audubon still supports offshore wind?
Yeah, because climate change is the biggest threat to birds, right? So Audubon's science team produced a report called Survival by Degrees, and that's available at climate.audubon.org. And it documents the predicted range losses of 389 species of North American birds if we fail to address climate change in a timely manner. And if we fail to mitigate climate effectively and we end up with a 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level scenario, which is not unlikely, by the way, we're going to lose at least 2/3 of North America's birds. The red knots that are so precious to Delaware Bay and to nature lovers in Delaware face extinction if we can't mitigate these impacts, because the potential loss of suitable habitat and what we also call phenological mismatch. So while we acknowledge a potential risk to these birds from offshore wind turbines, the risk of collision for birds like this is relatively low. And we are promoting studies to better understand those risks and document impacts so that we can better conserve bird populations that might be impacted from offshore wind. But these birds and many other shorebirds that fly from South America all the way to the Arctic every year are facing huge challenges as the temperature rises. They have a very narrow window in which to breed and nest and raise their young once they reach the Arctic. They don't get multiple chances like the shorebirds do on the coasts of Delaware and then around the mid-Atlantic. They get really this one chance to do it. If they fail that nest, they lose for the whole season. And they're timing their migration home so that they can reach the Arctic in time for their chicks to hatch at the exact same time that the mosquitoes hatch. And so even a small mismatch in this timing can be really detrimental. And if it happens over repeated seasons, you end up losing your population entirely. So we really need an efficient, radical change toward a net zero climate or net zero energy production in order to slow climate change. And doing so is going to require a diverse clean energy portfolio. And that includes onshore utility scale wind. It includes onshore utility scale solar. It includes community and rooftop solar, but it also really includes offshore wind production because we can make a lot of it.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. And we definitely need all kind of, I know I saw some comments on, community sized solar, but we actually need everything. We are in race against time to solve climate change. And we really need to use all kind of renewable energy resources, but offshore wind, as with Willett's presentation, we know that offshore wind can provide a chunk of 30% of Delaware's energy. I'll go to the next question. Alan, I know you have been the leading voice here in Delaware as a facilitator for newly created Mid-Atlantic Alliance on Climate and Health, bringing, ensuring we include health into the discussion about climate change. Would you share some of the health and climate benefits of offshore wind farms?
Sure, thank you. And just to clarify, my comments are going to be about stopping the use of fossil fuel, however we can do it, and echoing Shiloh and Willett and Chris. We're going to need a big portfolio. Our energy needs as a society will be increasing. They're not going to go away. And even though our country is already the largest consumer of electricity per capita in the world, but our needs are going to increase. The needs will increase throughout the world to keep people out, bring people out of poverty and improve the health and the nutrition around the world. So we're going to need every modality, and whichever modalities we choose, there are going to be some people who are going to say, that's not for us. Here's why. And I've heard that about solar downstate in Delaware. I've heard it about nuclear. I've heard it about not using electric vehicles for various reasons. So my point is going to be, we need to do everything we can. And the other message I want folks to get from this, and I'll give details in a moment, is that climate change and air and water quality is hurting the health of everyone now, today. It's not a future risk. It's been going on and it's going to get worse. It'll get worse as the air gets warmer, as the oceans get warmer. It'll get worse. Even if we stop using fossil fuels today, our air is going to have more carbon dioxide and more methane in them for the next 5 to 10 years, because we've gotten to a situation where the Amazon is not taking up as much carbon dioxide as it used to, as the Arctic is giving off methane. So we need to stop now in order to prevent further health consequences, in order to save money to our population and to our society. So, let me just give the details. The health burden from electricity generation worldwide is estimated at about 500,000 excess deaths each year. And that includes about 17,000 excess deaths in the United States. And that's because of what burning fossil fuels does. It has two effects. One is when we burn oil, coal, or natural gas, we put soot and smog into the air. And those have direct deleterious effects upon health. Also, carbon dioxide and methane, as well as smog and soot, all of which are products of burning fossil fuels, increase air and water temperature, change the climate, worsen the environment, and they also have deleterious effects on health. Each year, the American Lung Association publishes a report called the State of the Air. And anybody can go in there, put in their zip code, and they can look at the air quality in their community. And I'm going to give you, those of you in Delaware, I'm going to tell you what the report says about Delaware. That in the 2021 report, based upon the EPA standards for healthy air quality, Newcastle County received a grade of F, failing, for smog. Smog is also called ground level ozone, and received a grade of C for soot, which is also called particulate matter. These are some of the worst scores that you can imagine. It's hard to be below worse than failing. Less folks down in Kent and in Sussex feel great about their air quality. Both of those counties received a C for smog. Now, smog basically comes from burning fossil fuels in transportation. Diesel cars, electric hybrid cars that use gasoline, internal combustion engines. That's where our smog is coming from. The soot is coming from burning fossil fuels in power plants. And it turns out that a lot of our smog comes from downwind, comes from power plants in Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. Delmarva gets 20% of the power that it provides in Delaware from coal. And that's a statistic that comes directly from Delmarva. It gets 40% of its power from natural gas. It only gets 5% of its power from renewables. And that does lead to the what we said earlier, is we need to increase renewables no matter what they are. And we need to decrease that 60% that comes from fossil fuels. People at risk. The people at risk for poor air quality and for climate change related health issues are asthmatics, people with heart disease, people with chronic lung disease, people who live in communities where there's higher pollution levels. That means in Delaware and across our country, people of color, communities where people of color live, communities where people of lower income levels live. And there are 15,000 pediatric asthmatics in Delaware. Delaware has the second highest prevalence of pediatric asthma in the country. Many of those pediatric asthmatics live in our cities. They live where there are diesel school buses, diesel commuting buses, where highways carrying diesel trucks pass through every day, where we put the bus yards, where we put heavy industries. There are 75,000 adults in Delaware with asthma, including myself. There are 65,000 adults in Delaware with chronic lung disease. There are 75,000 adults with cardiovascular disease. There are 100,000 people living below the poverty level. And there's 380,000 people of color. So we have a large population in Delaware who are at risk for those things that are already in our air, which are soot, smog, methane, carbon dioxide. And just one thing to also remind ourselves is that we're just coming out, hopefully, of a COVID pandemic. It's been shown around the world, as well as in Delaware and the United States, that poor air quality, the kind of air quality we have in Newcastle County, results in an 18% higher mortality rate from COVID. That means in the United States, at least 160,000 people contaminated by soot from burning fossil fuels in power plants. People who didn't have to die because our air quality continues 50 years after we've known that burning fossil fuels increases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we haven't taken the steps necessarily to do it. So there are already health impacts from poor air quality and climate change, and there are many Delawareans already at risk. And these problems, as Willett previewed earlier, lead to financial problems. The majority of bankruptcies in this country are because of health costs. And worldwide, the cost of poor air quality is 3 to 5% of the gross domestic product. That comes out, as I said earlier, to at least $2,000 to $2,500 for every man, woman, and child in Delaware and in this country of excessive cost because we breathe poor air. And we're not immune. Because I live in a nice part of Delaware, it doesn't mean my air quality is better than that person who lives 3 miles away. It's because we're breathing air that comes downwind, and we're from fossil fuel plants, and we're breathing air from cars and buses and trucks that go up 95 and affects everybody's air quality. So once again, at the low end, we spend at least $2,000, $2,500 per person in Delaware. That comes from excessive costs of physician office visits, emergency care for asthma, hospitalizations, those medications that we buy for inhalers or to take care of our heart disease.
Well, I have to interrupt you here. I know you're very passionate about this.
Okay, give me 30
we
seconds.
just have very limited time to.
Okay, 30 seconds and I'll be done. Miss school, miss work, high insurance costs that everybody pays, even if you think you're healthy. If we replace, as Willett said, just 1/3 of our electricity needs, we can calculate it out that as a state, we'll save $60 to $70 million a year on health costs, excessive health costs.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, when we work towards solving climate change, we're solving so many other problems, and that's what we are trying to get to here today. But it's not only an environmental issue; it's a health issue. It is a food justice issue. It's just so many ways it impacts our communities today. I want to come back to Chris and just talk about this topic. A cable route from the farms through the inland bays to hook up near the Indian River power generating station on the Indian River is being explored as one of the multiple options for bringing power ashore. Can you talk about the potential environmental impacts of bringing the cables through the bays?
I think both companies, Ørsted and US Wind, are looking at multiple routes to bring the cables onshore to hook up to the grid. I think they're looking at land-based routes, and then they're looking at the water-based route through the inland bays. And so if they went the land-based route, they'd be, I believe, working in like utility right-of-ways, and there's a few options of different substations that they could hook up, and even a land-based route, they could potentially hook up at the Indian River Power Plant, which is almost all the way up the Indian River. So if they did a water-based route, they'd bring it through to Barrier Island somehow, and then bury the cable in the inland bays and bury it upriver to hook up at the generating station. So the center's position on this is that the inland bays are extremely ecologically sensitive and important water bodies. They're estuaries of national significance designated by Congress. They're state waters of exceptional recreational and ecological significance that have the highest protection of any waters in the state. So naturally, we want to avoid, to every extent possible, impacts to the bays from any industrial activity, including wind. So we really want to see a land-based route for these cables. And it's not just a concern from the existing 2 farms that are out there, but the fact that there's going to be more farms created. So, you know, the last thing we want is for the bays to be like a cable highway, because parts of the Indian River aren't even that wide. That said, we also don't want the sensitivity of the bays to prevent a project from happening. Because of everything that's been said here, the fate of our estuary and our communities is dependent upon a huge and very rapid amount of renewable energy happening, and wind is critical to that, right? So if those cables do have to come through the bays, we want to see as maximal coordination between the companies to minimize impact. My understanding is to get the cables in the bays, you dredge out the area, and then you lay the cable like at least 6 feet below the surface of the bays. And so I want to say a little bit, Shweta, if I can, about like what the impacts of that would be. Good news there is we know what those impacts would be from the dredging that already happens in the inland bays. We have a number of navigational channels for the boating community, and they're frequently dredged. What we see when dredging happens is that the community of animals that live on the bottom of the bays, they recover pretty rapidly. They're pretty transitory communities anyway, and they can bounce back pretty quick. We don't have hardly any bay grasses, underwater bay grasses that like Chesapeake Bay has or the Maryland Coastal Bay has. So that's not really a concern there. It's unfortunate because pollution wiped them out. We have very few oyster reefs, natural oyster reefs in our inland bays. So that habitat right now is not much of a concern there. And when they lay these cables, it's going to be quick. It's not like the channel is going to remain as it's been described to me. So the impacts there should be pretty low. There are concerns about electromagnetic fields coming from the cables. However, these cables are wrapped up, and the idea is to keep those fields from interacting with the bottom of the bay, and that's why they bury them deeply. We can't, you know, we can't say that we know what all the impacts of these things are going to be, but we do understand that there are trade-offs, and we do understand that we'll need to study some of these impacts. But some of the initial readings about these cables and their effects through the electromagnetic field suggest that there should not be much impacts on fish. There is some concern about like sharks and rays. They tend to be a little bit more sensitive to that. So a lot to consider, not just with the 2 farms that are proposed right now, but with, you know, the wind that could be coming in the future.
Thank you so much, Chris. I feel like all of you are such like great experts to be talking on these topics, and we're very fortunate to hear from you. I hope, like, you know, we're close to 7, but I still want to take a couple more questions if people can hang on for a few more minutes. Shiloh, not many people are aware that Audubon advocates for climate initiatives on federal level. Can you share more about something that you're working on currently, and just more about that?
Yeah, I can I can share a lot about what I am working on and what Audubon is working on. We generally provide federal support for climate initiatives that invest in responsibly sited renewable energy across the country, climate smart agriculture that benefits both producers like farmers and ranchers and wildlife, infrastructure that supports clean energy, and we also promote natural climate solutions that reduce climate threats like sea level rise, while also producing landscapes and protecting landscapes and restoring landscapes that help to sequester carbon through natural processes. Audubon has specifically advocated for climate provisions in the federal infrastructure bill, and we're working to preserve the climate components of Build Back Better. We're hoping that Congress funds the president's climate requests, and we're continuing to work with both Congress and the administration to advance our work to meet climate goals for net zero by 2030, or excuse me, 2050. We advocate for policies at the state level as well that set clean energy targets and encourage utility companies to transition to 100% renewables. And we've also advocated, of course, for strong protections for birds. I saw in the comments, mention of other bird species that are going to be impacted by offshore wind, and that's true. There are likely going to be some species that are that interact more than others. Northern gannet, for instance, are not protected by the Endangered Species Act, and we know from projects in Europe and from the distribution of northern gannets off of the coasts of the US that they are very likely to interact with offshore wind and be either displaced or potentially experience direct mortality through collision. So we want to strengthen the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So we have advocated for much stronger protections for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to make sure that non-endangered species are still protected from incidental take from offshore wind farms, but from other human uses in the ocean as well. And then we're also advocating for stronger protections for seabirds like albatross and petrels through legislative action to protect those taxa specifically. And while we don't really have albatross off of the Atlantic coast, we do have petrels. And so those protections are important. And I'll even put a little link in the chat so that you guys can sign on to an action that we have for protecting petrel and albatross. So those protections are important in order to make sure that there are mechanisms in place to protect birds from offshore wind impacts that they might potentially have, but also to strengthen their populations from other impacts so that if they do happen to be impacted from offshore wind, it doesn't actually affect their population. For offshore wind specifically, I also advocate for states to procure energy from offshore wind projects, and I serve on offshore environmental work groups for both the state of New York and Maine to advise the states on best practices so that they're building offshore wind in a manner that avoids, minimizes, and otherwise mitigates impacts to birds. I'm on a team that coordinates the Offshore Wind State of the Science meeting that's scheduled to be in person this year in June in New York. Very excited. I serve as a taxa expert on the Regional Wildlife Science Entity so that I can help inform research priorities for birds and offshore wind in the North and Mid-Atlantic. And I also coordinate renewable energy work groups and offshore work groups for both the Pacific Seabird Group and the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network, so that we are informing responsible adaptive management for seabirds and offshore wind through science.
Thank you, Shiloh. And people, we can share the links later, but you can always go to Audubon's website and join any initiative that you can. Well, maybe we can take one more question. I see a lot of questions here by David Stevenson, and he had sent me one question. I would like to take that. A Delaware 2018 working group determined offshore wind should not be required because of cost and environmental impacts, and nothing has really changed with environmental questions still unresolved, and the nominal cost of Skipjack 2 almost the same as Skipjack 1. Would you like to take that question?
Sure. The working group was a group of energy users and other people with an interest in energy, but really didn't do any detailed analysis. It was not a sort of technical or cost analysis group. It was more like a more like a citizens and kind of industrial users and politicians group, and they took the cost of energy at the time, cost of wind at the time, and it was expensive. So arguably they reached a correct decision by looking at prior offer prices, which were small projects, again, too small to be cost effective, and really, really early, where there was no experience and no proper vessels or anything. So I really don't understand why the questioner would say that the price hasn't changed. I don't know. I think that they should read up on what's going on these days, because there's been more than a 50% drop in cost, and that's published data. Although what we've done in our report is to adjust it so it's the same units. You can't take one thing that's in 2021 dollars and compare it to something that's in 2025 dollars, and also made the same escalator for all of those. So that if you want to look at what the price changes have been, I would recommend our own report as having done those adjustments and looking at through time. You can see really a big drop in cost, and between Skipjack 1 and 2, those are really different in cost. Even if you just take nominal dollars, it's a big difference in cost. So I'm not sure why that's sort of part of the question there, but so yeah, what's different is A, the cost is, they said the cost is too high. They were right. The cost is way lower now. And B, we actually have an analysis now rather than just sort of reading the newspaper and seeing what the prices are. We actually can see what things make the cost lower, what things make the cost higher, and how Delaware can do a procurement to either minimize the cost or maximize the jobs or do some of each. It's up to the state. But that's why that working group conclusion, I think, has been superseded by events.
Thank you, Willett. Thanks for answering that. I think we are at 7:07. So I would like to just thank everybody for joining us today, especially our panelists. I just want to maybe give you a quick minute to wrap it up. Any last thoughts that you have for our attendees today before we end this program? Shiloh, you want to go first? Ladies first.
Well, that's very generous. I just want to thank you for inviting me today, Shweta. This has been a really important topic. We know that these are not easy, that there really aren't any easy solutions here. This is a big industry, and we're looking forward to building it in a way that is responsible for the environment. But we do know that climate change is a huge problem. And so how we mitigate that is through a lot of creative solutions, and we need to do it through a really efficient, responsible build out of renewable energy, and that includes offshore wind. So the birds need that, the bird food needs that, and other wildlife need that, and so does the ocean. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be part of that solution, and I'm grateful that folks came here to hear about it.
Many thanks. Alan, you want to share any last thoughts?
One is to thank everybody, and I've learned a lot just by being here, and I think this is a process, as Willett said. Things are changing, and we know much more now than we did a couple of years ago about what climate change is doing to our oceans, to our wildlife, to people, and what it costs. And we know what the solutions are, and fortunately, most of those solutions are getting less expensive. Conservation and solar and wind. So, once again, just want to remind people that there's a large human cost for climate change and for poor air and water quality. They're there now. It's something that we can't wait more and more time before we do something about it. That human cost has a financial cost to everybody, not just the people who are sick, but anybody who pays for health care or lives in the community. And as you said earlier on, this isn't just doom and gloom. There are things we can do, and anything we do has a potential downside. We have to mitigate those downsides but move forward quickly, because doing nothing is more dangerous than anything we could possibly do for the future.
Thank you so much, Alan. Very well said. This is the time for action. There's just too much cost involved, especially for, what our children will inherit from us, for the future generations. So this is the time to take that action. And, please get involved. And before I talk too much, I want to just give it to Chris for any last comments that he wants to make.
I just want to thank you for having me, Shweta, and this was great, and I learned a lot. And I know that there's some really great advocates that are tuning in tonight and watching, and I just want to encourage everybody out there that is an advocate to keep it up. And for those that maybe haven't reached out to their electeds in a while or have never, we're so fortunate in Delaware. They listen. They work for the people, and just a quick email just to say, hey, I was just on a webinar with Alan and Willett, and the things that I heard is blowing my mind. I just heard that wind is going to be as cheap as what we get right now. And it doesn't have to be, you're important. Just an email from you can make a huge difference. So I always encourage that, and what a great time, because this is been some really great information. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much to all our guest speakers today and all our attendees for hanging out for so long. But I really appreciate you all joining us today. It is an important cause, and we really know, and we need to get to net zero by 2050. We have less than 10 years to get to net zero, and we know offshore wind can be a big part of that puzzle. And so let's study our options. Let's see what options do we have to get to net zero as quick as possible, and then create a political will to really change things here in Delaware. So Delaware IPL is doing our part. Let's do our part in knowing and acting, because inaction is not an option anymore. So thank you so much. Have a good night, and let's keep working on it.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.